Another function of financial reports is to provide information for financial contracting. Financial contracting as a use of accounting information, it probably has many similarities to stewardship, and you can sort of see this in terms of how it conceives the firm. Under financial contracting, we tend to emphasize the construction of the firm, which is provided by Jensen and Meckling, and they describe the firm as being a nexus of contracts. A nexus of contracts between providers of factors of production, principals, and managers who are responsible for the use of those resources, agents. And I suppose in that way it's not that dissimilar to the cotton mill situation we considered previously for stewardship. The critical thing about this way of constructing the firm is that you have a delegation of decision-making authority from the principal to the agent. And that has some consequences. Because when the decision's being made by other people, you're going to get other people's utility functions dictating how those decisions are made. And we more formally describe this as goal discongruence. And goal discongruence can be summarized really as people emphasizing their own self-interest, and in the case of managers, that's going to be managers maximizing their interest, potentially at the expense of shareholders. So you've got a bit of a tug of war going on there. In terms of how this relates to the firm, though, in relation to the manager and shareholder relationship, we can see how there is potential for goal discongruence between these two parties, because it may involve the manager having an excessive consumption of perquisites. The owner might have envisaged providing the manager with a car, and he was thinking something along the lines of a Hyundai i30, but let's just say that the manager had a slightly better perception of what a car was, and he got himself a Bentley. So perquisite consumption is one of the ways in which managers may take more of the benefits than they were originally intended to have. Another issue might be that managers will make decisions which reflect their employment horizon. So a manager who is close to retirement may be less inclined to undertake large R&D projects or large advertising campaigns, and these might be seen as maximizing the long-term profitability of the firm, but there'll be a short-term hit to the income statement, and so that may lead to managers and shareholders having different expectations of what's a good decision. We often think of managers as being associated with one company, and a consequence of this is that they often have a lot of their human capital invested in just one company. If you're very heavily invested in just one company, you're unlikely to undertake very, very risky projects. So maybe you might find that your managers tend to be a little bit more risk averse. And so the consequence of this is you have managers making different decisions compared to what the shareholders might have wanted. There are also agency costs that arise between managers and debt holders. When debt holders lend money to the firm, they do so with the expectation of a certain amount of risk and a certain expectation of return. Now, quite obviously, if the firm pays out excessive dividends, that's going to increase the financial risk. And if you hold the return constant, that means a reduction in the value of the debt. So what we can see here is that managers may have incentives to favour shareholders at the expense of debt holders. They have excessive distributions. Maybe they'll issue more and more debt, or they'll issue debt which has a more favourable security position. Maybe they'll get rid of assets which are nice and value stable, and if they replace those assets with highly unstable asset values, then maybe that will also result in the value of the debt holder's position. They may also be inclined to make investments which maybe pose excessive risk for the debt holders who have a limited participation in the upside risk. So there are a whole range of parties to the firm. I've considered just two of them here. Shareholders and debt holders as providers resources to managers. But there can be consequences to this goal discongruence, and this creates agency costs. Now, quite naturally, we can expect there to be strategies to try and bring this congruence together to mitigate it, to mitigate these agency costs. The strategies to mitigate these agency costs are broadly labelled as bonding. And bonding can be thought of as trying to achieve some sort of alignment between the incentives for the manager and the shareholder. And a good example of this would be a management compensation contract. If managers have a performance target which includes profit, they're going to want to make more profit. And that might be in the interest of shareholders as well. That will be in the interest of shareholders as well. So maybe through management compensation contracts, you can try and get alignment of the goals of managers and shareholders. You can also see it with debt contracts. And there may be interest rate penalties if leverage goes outside certain bounds. Another strategy to try and mitigate agency costs is through monitoring. Monitoring can effectively be thought of as governance and oversight, and the consequence of this is that there may be other sanctions. So poorly performing managers tend to get sacked, and there's a strong empirical literature on this. And that also creates an incentive for managers to make the right decisions. To the extent that agency costs can't be mitigated by bonding and monitoring, and that's an economic process. It's reliant upon the marginal costs and the marginal benefits of bonding and monitoring. There will be some sort of residual loss. Now you're probably wondering, how does this have anything to do with accounting? Well, the heavy lifting is done by accounting in a lot of these contracts. Bonding and monitoring often use information in financial reports, and where this becomes an issue is that it creates economic incentives. It has economic consequences. It gives economic consequences to the accounting practices which are chosen. It might be the accounting policies, and historically a lot of analysis or evaluation was undertaken of firms using quite obviously different accounting practices, LIFO or FIFO for inventory in the US, accelerated or straight line depreciation. So it does create economic incentives for people to choose particular accounting practices or to manipulate earnings management. And we often think of this in the context of a new manager comes in, takes an earnings bath, blames it on the last person, and that sets up mechanically a higher profit in future periods. So financial contracting is a significant use of accounting information these days. Does it have any practical implications? Well, probably a bit like stewardship. Financial contracting requires certainty about the information being used, so it's probably going to emphasize completed transactions, its historic performance, not expected future performance, and there's going to be an emphasis on recording transactions, probably on an historic cost basis because they're more reliable from a contracting point of view. So it's probably fair to say that if we just had stewardship and financial contracting as functions of accounting, the outcomes probably wouldn't be that dissimilar.